History is full of what-if moments, especially in the modern world. One decision, one event, or one person could have completely changed the course of history. But what if things had turned out differently? Today, we explore modern what-if scenarios and ask, how would the world be different? Let's dive in. September 11th, 2001 changed the world forever. The terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon not only led to the loss of thousands of lives, but also triggered the War on Terror, two major wars, and drastic changes to global security policies. But what if the attacks never happened? Imagine a world where the US never invaded Afghanistan or Iraq. The War on Terror wouldn't exist as we know it, and perhaps global politics would be less focused on counterterrorism. Would civil liberties have been less restricted? Would the Middle East look different today? How would geopolitics have changed? Without 9/11, would the US still be involved in such a large-scale military presence abroad? Let us know in the comments, how different do you think the world would be if 9/11 had never happened? The internet has become the backbone of the modern world, transforming everything from communication and commerce to education and entertainment. But what if the internet had never been invented? Without the internet, our world would look vastly different. Social media wouldn't exist, and businesses would rely on more traditional forms of marketing and communication. Long-distance communication would be slower, and the idea of working remotely or video conferencing would be unthinkable. Would globalization have been slowed down without instant information? How would the lack of internet have affected political movements, education, and entertainment? Share your thoughts below. How different would your daily life be without the internet? For decades, the world lived under the shadow of the Cold War. The US and the Soviet Union built massive nuclear arsenals, and the threat of World War III was ever present. But what if the Cold War had turned hot? What if the Cuban Missile Crisis or another standoff had led to nuclear war? If nuclear weapons had been used, the world as we know it could have been wiped out. Major cities across the globe could have been obliterated in hours, and the aftermath would have been unimaginable. Radiation poisoning, environmental destruction, and the collapse of governments. How would a post-nuclear world have rebuilt itself? Would civilization have survived, or would we be living in a new dark age? Let us know in the comments. What do you think the world would look like if the Cold War had escalated? By the late 1980s, scientists were already warning about the dangers of climate change, and there was a growing awareness of environmental issues. But what if world leaders had taken decisive action back then? Imagine a world where climate policies were enforced decades earlier. If we had embraced renewable energy, curbed emissions, and reforested the planet back then, the effects of global warming might be much less severe today. Rising sea levels, extreme weather events, and wildfires could have been mitigated, and we might have avoided some of the environmental catastrophes we face now. Would the global economy have been different, with industries shifting towards sustainability earlier? And what kind of world would we be living in today if climate change had been addressed 40 years ago? Share your thoughts below. How do you think the world would be different? The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of the Cold War and the dissolution of one of the world's most powerful empires. But what if the Soviet Union never collapsed? Imagine a world where the Soviet Union remained intact and continued to be a dominant superpower. In this alternate reality, Eastern Europe would likely still be under Soviet influence, and the geopolitical landscape would be vastly different. The rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union would likely have continued into the 21st century, potentially heightening tensions and extending the arms race. Would there have been another global conflict? How would technological and space advancements have evolved under continued Soviet leadership? Would the economic struggles that plagued the Soviet Union in the 1980s have led to reform or stagnation? And what would life in Eastern Europe and Central Asia look like today? Let us know in the comments. How do you think the world would look if the Soviet Union never collapsed? Would it have been a global competitor to the US or crumbled under its own weight? History is full of turning points, and just one change could have led to a completely different world. These modern what-if scenarios show us just how fragile our reality is. But what do you think?